Linh non đang con bởi chỉ xin chẳng bị mà cho ta bởi năng kế mà trở trên như trên trở nên ta năm ta rộng sao chỉ nhiên đang cái chỉ xin xin sẽ nhị kiến đông ga lệ bát Hàn đó sẽ biết ra mà rễ mình tới đông anh kế Rose up and I'm virgin, that's you and I to joy on there. Don't touch a doing and more than on a year, John John Johnson. Marem is an online yoke. Genian Jizera Cheno. Then and all joys are joy, there's a yonder in line, Yazin Lowe. Dân ta cho tai cho nhị dân trẻ có lẽ mình sẽ chẳng bề yang lâm thì mà có một cái nhà mà là mà mà làm bao giờ nói đến dân để cái rồi sai đến đó lên để bị mong mình bắt ਰੱsang down danger, young and the bar. No damn bum and no one's on the we long said, oh, and the bottom. Johnson, do what I don't know. Number Jarian Jinin, and remember young song was show. And she's garage. Zembama Vema Zemon Vishu. Susur Nam Yan Den Den Yazar Zon under the mine on Lord Go on. One yes, I get near been to the yes, and it and don't talk and so going well. Nanda son de ne de denda gan son jero limbe shala so Yamba in Jeman ben me namban to jase lonje yang se jojin. Bambo and den ben ma long la ben jaya dente wombo so then. On Bondian, like chamber long mouth, the jam on edging the so. Then man, then you and then you saw and then or then your job lives all and down on the cherry and yeah, but there's on yeah, right there. Slam down worm on then ball. So long shall go warring. Me wall bumble, get more than the den, but I'm the can do it. Engine I get it. One dang and on the legit and my mom combined and it's in Ginton Brim and get something to get some of the car bridge in by the trouble. And which is among in and yam to one book and then repent people to do number for campus and so that December shores. So please listen with the motivation or the Guru Chitta, thinking that for the purpose of establishing all other sentient beings equal in extent to space on the level of omniscience, the level of omniscient Buddha, I will now listen to the Dharma and put it into practice and accomplish it. Just to be it, that I make to the particular later. On the Pella to then the long bit could take member of the bus. Member Namnin that could give me a back. Member the tank of falling back. Member you out it. No, you're and bone the year in the So the teaching today is on the preliminary practices from the Guru's heart practice, dispeller of all obstacles. And there are 5 main topics here. The meaning of the phrase preliminary practices, how the preliminary practices are important, the extensive, medium length, and concise preliminary practices, how the preliminary practices gather the accumulations and through the obscurations, and the types of preliminary practices. And now we're on the fifth out of those five, the types of preliminary practices. So there are then within the types of preliminary practice, there are three types. The preliminaries of material items, the preliminaries to the meditation session, and the preliminaries to the main part. And we are now in the preliminaries to the main part, of which there are two. The common outer preliminaries and the uncommon inner preliminaries. And within the common outer preliminaries, there are the four thoughts that turn the mind from samsara. The difficulty of obtaining the freedoms and advantages, death and impermanence, karma, cause and effect, and the faults of samsara. And we are currently going over the faults of samsara. Within the topic of the faults of samsara, we have the faults of samsara and sufferings of samsara in general, and the individual sufferings of the six realms. And now we are in the section on the individual sufferings of the sixth realm. So, and within the topic of the individual suffering in the sixth round, we have now finished going over the sufferings of hell, the sufferings of the creature realm, and the sufferings of the animal realm. And we are now talking about going over the sufferings of the human realm. So within the sufferings of the human realm, we have for example, the three root sufferings and the 8 grade sufferings. And now we are currently going over the 3 root sufferings. And one of those 3, we finished the suffering of suffering and the suffering of change. And now we will discuss the pervasive suffering of addition phenomena. So to start to go over the suffering, the pervasive suffering of conditioned phenomena, we can start by taking apart the phrase itself. the name of the suffering itself, the pervasive suffering conditioned phenomena. So first of all, the word pervasive there, this refers to the fact that this type of suffering is the ground or the basis out of which other suffering arises. And as for the term here, conditioned, this refers to the fact that the outer vessel world and the inner contents of the beings are conditioned or formed by the karma and the afflictions. All of this existence, the entirety of his existence, is a condition or formed by these causes and conditions. So this kind of suffering is the ground, the basis out of which all suffering arises. And so we should understand that in the following way. The pervasive suffering of conditioned phenomena is kind of the state which is just ready and always ready to produce manifest suffering. So here, the word conditioned is also used to refer to this quality of being just ready to produce suffering, or it is just ready to produce suffering. It's the suffering is always very close and ready to come out of that state. So for example, it's going to be explained, for example, by the fact that conditioned phenomena are all impermanent. And being impermanent, they will inevitably give rise to suffering. So in this way, this suffering is termed the pervasive suffering conditioned phenomena. Because the conditioned phenomena are always changing. They're always ready to change. They're unstable that way. So that being the case, this is kind of a situation of suffering. So for example, if we consider a person who has a cause for a disease or sickness within themselves, that cause for the disease which has not become manifest yet, and the cause is still latent, that the cause of the disease within them that's still latent would correspond here to the term pervasive. And then when that cause becomes just ready to produce the illness, when it's about to produce the illness, that would correspond to the term here, conditioned. And then when that cause produces its effect, and the person actually gets sick, in actuality, then that is here corresponds to the term suffering. So this is the way to understand the term itself, the phrase, pervasive suffering of conditioned phenomena. Or we can also say the pervasive suffering of the conditioned, would fit better with Lama's explanation. But as far as the explanation, the general meaning of the term, it refers to the suffering that is just ready to manifest, that is just poised to manifest and become manifest and become actual suffering itself. So in this way, the pervasive suffering of the conditioned is this suffering that, although it is not manifest yet, it is certain to manifest as suffering. It's ready and it's certainly going to manifest as suffering. So that being the case, what does this refer to in terms of our own experience? Is refers to our bodies, our possessions, material possessions, everything we enjoy in our lives, everything we use and enjoy in our life. And then around so the big and then around so the big sent it, take out the money on the bar. And then around to the big nick, no longer Genova, so what until the take up and that one young by in a young, Mong Pala, and the money on the future. As we are now, our body is not necessarily giving us suffering at this moment, and our mind is also not giving us suffering at this moment. And our wealth and possessions, the things that we use and enjoy in our lives, those are not necessarily giving us suffering in a manifest way now, but the point here is that they are certain to do that in the future. They're certain to give us suffering in the future. So what is the reason? What is the reasoning behind considering that our body and our mind and our possessions, so the things that we use and enjoy, why can we say that they are the pervasive suffering of the conditioned? How does that work? And then around so that any the yoba Sonam, any the la ten, any the thing la, any the wash. And then around so la Lui di yoba imba Sonam, lui di kiteni, tungal shi yonguyo.
So as far as our body, it's in dependence on our body that we experience happiness, pleasure, and it's also in the dependence on our body that we experience pain and suffering.
세상 마랑서라 lui 기땡라 대화 식당 동al shi yongidoba. 민두게 마랑서 yongidoba. 세상 마랑서 대화 nyongwate 아니 규르의 동al 차거든. 가르세나 대화대 마랑서 르르 예배 대화대 테니 갈래 파 규르 미다바 차거 미다바 동al 차거. 세상 대 대화대 규르의 동al 차거. 양 마랑서 리기 땡라 동al shi yongu요. 동al shi yongwate 가르차고래 동al지 동al 차거. 동알게 동알 차비 요바 점점 가려서나 나랑랑도 동알지 요나 양 대팅나 동알 심바지 레기 건 고거지 요래 거가 대인데 동알기 동알 차비
So our body experiences both pleasure and pain in this way, right? And the pleasure that our body experiences, in fact, is the suffering of change, because that pleasure, being permanent, will inevitably change, and it will become suffering. And as far as the pain that our body experiences, this is the suffering of suffering. And that is because when we have this body and we experience pain, it is giving the opportunity, it provides the opportunity for there to be suffering upon suffering on top of other suffering. So this is, and the pain of the body in this way is also the suffering of suffering.
And then 오늘 동알기 동알당 규르의 동알대 가와나 때는 연구도 말하는 삼로치 다운 바이나 털 류기 때는 연구도 와 세상 류이들라 동알기 시여 시여바 인디 시디 아니 두제기 원주고요 두제기 원주 용데 테니 동알 연구요
두제기 원주사
두제 다진이나 두제 랍소 세지 동알기 쪽쪽 소그리 랍소 두제기 양원주고라 시디 류로아 시디 류 예배인데 동알기 시여 다 계기 동알기 시 다 데이팅라 가리 연구했으나 테니 류기 띵네 테니 규르의 동알당 아니 동알지 리기도 와 온디 데 안내 버치긴 수레 두제대로 와 두제대로 레버 치디 아니 동알 연구요 테니 캬바 두지 동알 스타파 보기도 와
네. So these two types of suffering that happen and depends on the body, the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering. And then we have to think about where do they come from. And they both are dependent on the body, right? So that being the case, we can see how the pervasive suffering of the condition functions this way. Because these two types of suffering have as their basis the body. And so what happens is that the conditioned nature of the body allows these kind of sufferings to manifest. So this is how the pervasive suffering of the condition is related to the body.
동알기 동알당 규르 동알디 가와르 때는 랩송 류나 때는 랩송 류디 아니 규르 동알당 동알기 동알 깨지기 규르도 어디 캬바도지 동알 류랑 캬바도지 지금 저 캬바도지 동알 가르래 샤송 류에 샤송 셈 샤송 균노론데 참마 캬바도지 동알 샤송 대탐 제트니 규르 동알당 동알기 동알 깨지기 규르
Right. So we contemplate where does the suffering of suffering and the suffering of change, where do those two come from? What do they depend on to come into being, to come to be experienced by us? And they arise due to the body. So in this way, the body is the basis for those two kinds of suffering, the body being conditioned in that way. So here, as we're talking about the kind of instantiations or the what the suffering, the pervasive suffering of the condition consists of, we talk about how it consists of the mind, the body, or in the order that Drupla is explaining it, the body, the mind, and our possessions and enjoyments. So here we can see how the body is the body relates to the pervasive suffering of the condition being the basis for these other two kinds of suffering.
하지만서 캬바도 지지 동안 컨디션이 동안 원규로 매장 몽발라 동안 중교인바 네바 랍사 리코랑 동안 원규로 말에 몽발라 동안 중교 네바래 네데 가른 얘기도 규르의 동안 땅 동알기 동안 랩용도 띵에도 율라테는 랩기도 셰르 랩고 말아 멸레테는 랩기도 제상 류데 단다 동안 원규로 말 류데라 테네 몽발라 니 규르의 동안 땅 동알기 동안 랩기요
So as I explained just a little bit earlier, the pervasive suffering of the conditioned, what it is in its essence is a suffering that is, although not manifest at present, is certain to manifest in the future. It is definitely, it's definite to manifest in the future. So this is how we can understand this here as regards to the body, that the body, although we are not experiencing suffering at present necessarily in the body, there still is this pervasive suffering of the condition within the body, because it is certain to produce real suffering and pain, experience suffering and pain in the future, and that actual pain are exactly the other two kinds of suffering: the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering.
세상 위에 캬바도 지지 동안 그래도와 이바디 셈데 양안한테 셈데라 땡데 셈여발라 땡데 땡 셈라 서로한 대화 서로와시 연구요 셈라 서로와 동말 서로와시 연구래 영어민들과 영어도 안한테 상말라 셈라 셈 기부여바다 셈 두부여바 니 영어도 어한디 사 셈 대화 여바 레바디 아니 규르의 동말 아그 대화 딱바 말아 타르베기 대화디 말아 직땡기 대화라 직땡기 대화도 미다과래 미다과인데 규르고요 에 규르의 동말스야 셈딜라 때네 규르의 동말 양 셈딜라 때네 동말 중교래 동말 중교 여바디 아니 동말디 동말 차고 콜라 카르스나 동말 태바지 양 영주 여바야 돼 영주 여바인데 코 동말디 동말 차 세상 셈나 때네 양 규르의 동말감 동말 동말 얘기도 세상 양 셈디 양 잡아도 지지 동말 차
So this is how the body, in fact, has the nature of the pervasive suffering of the condition. And now, as far as the mind, well, with our minds, we experience both pleasure and pain, right? We both have times where we're feeling good mentally and times where we're not feeling good mentally. And so the pleasure or the happiness that we experience in our mind is actually the suffering of change again. And because this kind of pleasure or happiness is impermanent, so it's inevitably will change and will transform into suffering. In fact, this is our because this is the nature of our mental happiness in the worldly kind of happiness as ordinary people. And then when we are feeling pain in our mind and unhappiness in our mind, that in fact is the suffering of suffering, because on top of a state of suffering, we again experience additional suffering, more unhappiness on top of that, with this kind of mental pain. So this is how the mind is the basis for those two sufferings. So it's the condition, the pervasive suffering of the condition.
And then do similar thing, Kuru Tumal Tam, Tumali Bitumal, Chungu Yobate, similar thing Chungudoa, Chesang Semdi, Yushago, Tumatis.
So in this way, it is dependence on the mind that we will experience the suffering of change related to the mind, and the suffering of suffering related to the mind. The mind in this way is the basis, the ground out of which these sufferings come about. So in this way, the mind is the pervasive suffering of condition.
Kasumba no longer over time, Chabadosi to Chabier.
So, and in the same way, our wealth and possessions, enjoyments, these are also the pervasive suffering of the condition.
Penang around the Tanda in Sanki Tuzela, Tene, iPhone Shibaki, cover Yahoshi, Tene around top somewhere, Tene around Dewashi Libidua, cover de la Tene Dewashi Libidua. Young cover the Mar Sagne Chabaina, cover de la Tene young to Tomaj Libidua. Oh, they did cover de la Lene, Dewan Libiobati, Curitumare. Cover de la Tene, Tene Tumal Chungiobati, Tumalji Tumare. Chetang, Kuno Jungo, Chamana Tendegita. Dungalgi Duwe Dungalgi Tini Sabin, Chungsagi Sabin, Kabatuji Dumati Tini Terimare.
So as far as our possessions and enjoyment, for example, the iPhone is considered to be such a valuable and really nice phone, right? So let's say we get an iPhone somehow, and after we get the iPhone, we're very happy. We experience a lot of happiness to have this nice new thing. And then it could happen that after having the phone for some time, it may break, and then we would lose that phone, and then feel unhappiness and suffering due to that. So here, the getting the phone, obtaining that phone, is the action, and that feeling of happiness we get with that experience is in fact the suffering of change, because it changes. It's impermanent, and it will change it to suffering. And then when the phone breaks and we lose the phone, and we feel unhappy because of that, that is the suffering of suffering. And in this way, these two sufferings come about in dependence on this iPhone, this possession, this material possession.
Tenden인데 돈이 아나운서 기타 결국에 동알당 동알기 동알띠 철화래 철화라 철을 강하셔 버려 철원 대촉 철화 동알기 촉스도와 네 결국에 동알 대외촉 네 철화 동알띠 미대외촉 다 대니 중사기 시도와 대니 중사기 시디 가라는 아나운서 아나운서 셈 아나운서 직된 카메라에 뵙기 균노망지 중고부 창만도와 대탐제 아니 철화 땅님을 셔 버려 콜라 철화 땅염래, 고 철화 원이 연말에, 거기 철화 원제 치기로 와, 철화 원제, 철화 단덕원이 연말아, 제일 원제 치기로 와. 어디 철화 땅염스, 때는 만들어 철화 대화, 철화 동알, 철화 땅염스 와. 네. 철화 땅염스 되고 저 철화 망원 봐. 그 철화 대화스네, 철화 대화 원로 와, 철화 샤르, 원스나 철화 끼래, 철화 동알스는 철화 끼래.
ina yang tegi nya la ngarang chula yobe lui dang sem dang juno lo jong bo da chura ke yo mara chura tang yum de de ko tanda sendi dunga ngon jura wa tema ngon de
So there's two kinds of suffering, the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering. These two are related.
so
Related to this is because toward the because
di chura ngon jura shar di
so those two, the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering, those are manifest and actually experienced as a manifest sufferings and manifest sensations. And those are related to the sensations of pleasure and the sensation of pain, respectively. So the suffering of change is related to the sensation of pleasure, and the suffering of suffering is related to the sensation of pain. And these are manifest and actually, being experienced. And then the basis or ground from which those experiences of suffering come about, the basis out of which they arise, our body and mind and wealth, enjoyment, and possessions. Those we can correlate with the sensation of neutrality, neutral sensation, because those phenomena, the body, mind, and our possessions and wealth, they are not necessarily being experienced as in an actual way in the present time. They're not being experienced as a manifest sensations of pleasure or pain as the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering is experienced. They are kind of latent there. So they're not manifest.
제장 가장 먼저 미드말라 드니 자위 동아 숨 시샤서 자위 동아 숨 나와 근데니 동아지 동아 당 드니 교리 동아 심리 공도 쉬바 오 디니기 충사 자완다부디 다 잡아두진 동아 다른 쉬되기디 예 잡아두지 잡아두지 동아대 교리 동아 당 동아지 동아 충사기 시작.
So the other day we went over among the three root sufferings of the suffering of change, suffering, and the pervasive suffering of the condition. We were discussing the first two, the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering. And so what we're talking about now, the pervasive suffering of the conditioned, is the basis for these previous two other sufferings. It's the basis out of which those other two sufferings arise.
차바도지 동아된 먼저 단다 커샤고 인스는 실단기 파기에나 홍보만을 소바 샤츠고 이내 단다 먼저 출 류용비 류다 셈다 기노론 지중원 뭐 숨라 샤바인바 해숨디 차바도지 yes.
So there's we could also define the pervasive suffering of the condition as the five aggregates. But in a simpler explanation, we can understand it as we are talking about it here, which is as the body, the mind, and our possessions.
동아지 동아당 규례 동아지 규다고 계제디 되니 차바도지 동아래도 다 이나양 차바도지 동아디 가와라 때니 게도 삼나 되니 내당 녀만 바니를 때네 내당 녀만 법이 시원한 때니 게바시.
Okay, so we can understand, and we should understand how and the body, the mind, and the possessions are the pervasive suffering of the conditioned, which are the ground out of which and due to which the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering arise. But then we also should understand where does the pervasive suffering of the condition as the body, mind, and our possessions, where does that come from? What is the cause of that? And the cause of that is karma and the afflictions.
레다 녀만 봤으되 녀만 봤으되 미시바 땅아라도 위당 셈당 니 균노롱제 된저도 가와라 때네 총소아레스네 미시바라 때네 총소 미시바라 때네 가르총아레 녀만 봐 총소아레 녀만 봐 미시바 뜻샤 녀만 봐 시당 녀만 봐 미시바 띠모로 소바 녀만 봐 말라 소바 때네 총 녀만 봐 말라 때네 아니 레치선 레사도 레사도데 아니 지금 코로나가 기온데 따테네 위당 셈당 니 균노롱제 뭐 보창로 급급도와
So the karma and the afflictions are the cause of this pervasive suffering of the conditioned. And what are the afflictions? In essence, they are a lack of knowing, a lack of understanding, not knowing. So we don't understand. And then give rise to desire, and we are in a state of ignorance and give rise to anger, and in this way the five afflictions come about as well, all those five afflictions. And then once we have those five afflictions based on lack of understanding, on not knowing, not understanding, then we will accumulate karma. And through accumulating karma, we take birth in samsara, and all of these phenomena that we experience in our lives then come about in that way due to our afflictions and the karma and our birth in the world.
And then in the Chabaduchi, Tungal Woyute, and the Ledan Yamabacha, Tini Tungal down, Guru Tungal down, Tungalki, Kuting, Woyute, Chabatuchi Tungasha. Any Lenny de, Tene Chin, Changmeki, Changme, Tungalki, Jungoni, Jungamat.
So, in this way, the actual cause of the pervasive suffering of the conditioned is karma and the afflictions. And the actual cause of the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering is the pervasive suffering of the conditioned. So here, the ultimate cause then is are the afflictions and the karma.
Kakindegi, Deni la tene, Kesha Faki, Savidonga, Sombote la tene, Tenemananzola Tanda, Ninja Sunke, Yores, and Sunyer. Ninja Sum.
So then in relation to these three types of suffering, the three root sufferings, which are produced by karma and the afflictions, we also have now the three types of compassion.
I need just somebody Karesana, and then Simjela make Ninja, Chola make be Ninja, anybody Ninjas in the Sumsong of the S.
So these three are the compassion that has sentient beings as its object, and compassion that has the dharmas the dharma as object, and the compassion beyond object.
Simjela make Ninja, Tene Tungal, the Curve Simjan Namla, 아니 닝지 기야온데 심전라 미괴 닝제 소.
So the first one, the suffering that has sentient beings as its object, this is the compassion that takes into consideration and is compassionate for beings that are experiencing the suffering of suffering.
해가래 코로나가 몽베 심전 텐서라 근데 동알와 통화이나 테레닝지 개바테레 테라 심전라 미괴 닝제스.
So this is the compassion that we have when we see beings suffering within samsara and consider the suffering of beings within samsara. This is the compassion which has sentient beings as its object.
미하나 아니 사스이면 발테네 테네 동알와 뇽에 심전 남라 아메 닝제 개송와테라 네 심전라 미괴 닝제 라멘데.
Or we can also consider this kind of compassion, the compassion which takes sentient beings as its object. We can consider it to be the compassion that we have for sentient beings who are experiencing a suffering as a result of being defiled, of having this defiled existence.
네 쇼라미 비는제 셰바테 아니 그레 동알라 미네 닝지 개바테라 테니 쇼라미 비닝제 셰베 가디 추 세디가서 타나나 지르단 기추 세계 여마도 아니 기회체라세 제단 기추 용도가 고레스.
So then the suffering that has phenomena or dharmas as its object, this is the compassion that we feel towards beings, that we feel towards them due to them experiencing the suffering of change. We have compassion for beings that are experiencing the suffering of change. So this is called the compassion that takes phenomena or dharmas as its object. But here we don't understand, we should not understand the term dharmas here to refer to like a virtuous dharma. It just means phenomena, general dharmas, phenomena.
하데 가레스나 코레나라 테니 토리기 나라 네베기 대화 예바 촐라 테니 나온 속이 기루이 동아디 세겐 속이 대명지 기원 그레스.
So this kind of compassion comes about for those who consider the sentient beings that are living in the higher realms and experiencing what appears to be happiness in the higher realms. When we understand the nature of the suffering of change, if somebody understands the nature of the suffering of change and contemplates and considers those beings living in the higher realms, then they give rise to this kind of compassion, the compassion that takes phenomena as its object.
야나 사제지 계획 대화 민바테나 테니 니제 제바테나 테니 철람이 비민지 시아마야 디그레스 사제지 계획이 아니 네갑기 대화라 네갑기 대화디 주라임바 헬라양 테니 시게.
Yeah, or we can understand, alternatively, we can understand this kind of compassion to be the compassion that we may have for beings that are experiencing temporary happiness that comes about due to their defiled virtue, and by performing and carrying out defiled virtue, they get a temporary experience of happiness, but it's not lasting. So it's this suffering. So it's actually suffering. So that's the another way to think about the compassion that takes phenomena as its object.
mikpa mebe nyingje de tene 차바두지 동말라 미네 테닝지 제가테 아니미 밤에 빙제.
So as far as the compassion that is beyond any object, this is the compassion that takes into account and is compassionate about the pervasive suffering of the conditioned of beings.
다딘데기 닝제 숨보테 간사 수수기 유라 유레 sen 셰바이나 에니 나 셀젤레믹 빙제디 소세기오기 유라야 요레스 에니 철라믹 빙제디 아니 소세기오기 유라 아니 영크베 카포레스 톨람담 jorlam니라 테니 예베기 컨설턴트라 니데 아니 철라믹 빙제디 아니 미밤에 빙제디 테 파베사토바 통함 진행 것음제 템포 통화 된절라 테니 잡아도스지도 나데 시르도요레스 테미제기 시르도요마레스.
So then if we consider what kinds of people, what kinds of beings experience these three different types of compassion, first of all, the compassion that takes sentient beings as its object is experienced by ordinary beings. And then the compassion that takes phenomena as its object is difficult for ordinary beings to experience. It's not very, they wouldn't normally experience it, but this is experienced by people that are on the path of accumulation and the path of preparation. People practicing on those two paths will experience the compassion that takes phenomena as its object. And then as far as the compassion that is beyond object, this is experienced by those who have attained the first bodhisattva bhumi and directly realized the nature of reality. For those beings, they experience the compassion that is beyond any object. And for beings who are below that level of realization, they cannot experience this compassion that has no object.
하데 간데레스나 마라우소 소소기오기 이 선진 선바텐조 동아로 청왕아란 그 시용 인지지기도 심절미 비민지를 대나온데 게트도 다 교로에기 동아데 아니 안저기 시기 말에 마시온데 완전 인지지기 말에 배낭아란 좀 미추고 잡고 에 기부체네 대바잡고 아니 콜라 동알 메바타고 통에나 완전 콜라 인지지기래 지기 말와 하디 수기기랬으나 소람마 저람마 되겠는데 비기기 강사나 거기 대화디 규라시기 온도 인지지기로 와. 그 대화디 대화 마인바 비마라 임바 시구라 규르 등을 공기 시기로 와. 규르 등을 시용도 근데 처럼이 비니지기용도 와. 이게 와. 되네 가르쳐 버려. 켜버도지기 동할때 아니 허바 상계당 전주선 만남지 되네 켜버도지기 동할 통으로 와. 이나 소시기오당 초람바다 저람바다 통금면도 위 동아리엔 받고 시에트고 말와 샘 동아리엔 받고 시에트고 면도 안에 대가나시 두제징 오버도 동아리엔 받고 시에트고 면도 내나 녀모 받아서 미셰바엔 받고 시에트고 면도 제상 그 미시 양데 아니 코비디 미바 메베닝제디 게트고요.
So we all have the experience when, as ordinary people, when we see somebody suffering, going through an obviously difficult time and going through pain, we feel compassion generally, right, for those kind of people. This is our compassion which has sentient beings as its object and is compassionate towards the suffering of beings. But then we generally, as ordinary people, we would not necessarily feel compassion towards people experiencing the suffering of change. Like, for example, if there's a really rich person who is totally taken care of and enjoying himself so much, no problems, and so on and so forth. We normally would not feel compassion for that kind of person, right? As far as any suffering, we don't see much suffering there. But those who are on the paths of accumulation and preparation, they would look at that same person and understand that that experience that he is having, this situation of wealth and apparent happiness, is in fact the suffering of change, because it's impermanent, and they will understand that that situation of this person is in fact a situation of suffering, and then this is how they will have the compassion that takes phenomena as its object. And when we get to the compassion that say is beyond the object, this is what the compassion of the noble beings, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, because unlike us, they can see and they understand that the body itself and the mind itself has the nature of suffering, and that our possessions are nature of suffering, and that our karma and afflictions, that these in fact have the nature of the suffering, nature of the pervasive suffering of the condition. So, but those who are below this level of realization, below that the level of being a noble being, as they call it, like us, for example, we can't see that the mind and the body, in fact, are the nature of suffering, or that the karma and the afflictions are suffering, this pervasive suffering of the condition. So we won't have we are not able to give rise to the compassion that is beyond any object.
And then the Pangin Dongwa, maybe about the Latin on the Niji Ketubutua, Minawara, Samson and maybe in the Celebrate. In the Samson, Kibu Yobatazala Manzuri Niji Ketubumendoa. Hey, and in Chowan Bang, Jaramla Shuvedi, and such of the Tongu. The Karastongo Resna, and it is me like in Yima, Sigdua. Debe Tola, Turdepe, Troni Palcaldi, Trembota, Troned, Terror Debe, Lomate, Single. And a quang the finger that the Zomyong gets through young Jiggy, Zomni Kipachene de Jodi, and a Pata Dickin the Odo or the Manibo diggings, Kibumus, Arasana, Zomba de Taroaretus, Zomba de Taro and then Mani Kibashigi, the money to my shake to Usumba. What ended up? They all lap, we need the Jigota.
They teach a younger son.
Teach a Tola Turdepe, Honey, a Divya Tola Turdepe, Troman Hondi can water, doing a tower devon, long it is. Doing it ever did it one of this. Only to the invisible, Divachana and the Kibu invisible. We get come upon the Tibetan and Deva and I keep him invisible. Rather than a Mara, getting what on Karachi does some keep it off. You just say Maranaku, all the button there jump over the language that doing the kid. So maybe yes.
So for us to have compassion for people that are obviously in pain and experiencing suffering, this is pretty easy, right? For us, it's natural that we would get this feeling of compassion for people, for people like that. But it's not so easy for us to have compassion for people who are not in obvious pain and who seem to be very happy, very rich, and so on and so forth. We can't really see the suffering of that, so we don't have compassion for it. But an example of somebody who could see that is Milarepa. And he taught one verse that goes the meeting of friends, which seems to be happy, is actually just like meeting the meeting of people at a marketplace, and inevitably they will separate, and it actually is a suffering. So I'm not interested in this so-called happiness. This is the meaning of the verse that was taught by Milarepa. So he for us and for most people, we would view getting together with our friends and family and so on as being a happy occasion, and we get together with them and have fun and eat and what have you. And we don't generally understand that it's in fact suffering. But what Milarepa is saying here is that these kind of meetings are actually of the nature of suffering, and because they're impermanent, they're just like a meeting in the marketplace, where people come together and then they immediately, before too long, will separate and go their separate ways. So what we perceive to be happiness changes inevitably before too long and becomes overall an experience of suffering.
Ade ane ngal ko kirwa indi tini ngal do sese de de tok de no. Ngal ko la ide ra ni de katsen ko di jela tungal ide ra ko ngal de tok ko marwa. O folam de la shobe ki no de de ta ki tok mi. Tok mi de tele ni de ke ki.
So this kind of suffering is actually hidden. It's not manifest. It's not apparent for us. It's kind of hiding. It's kind of like just behind the experience of happiness. There's suffering actually hiding behind there, because we can't see that suffering. It's not apparent to us, that suffering. But those who are on the paths of accumulation and preparation, they are able to see how these apparently happy experiences, pleasant experiences, are the suffering of change.
Pami ba me yin je ti tene pa ba kan sala era en sun ti ani karase person. Chaba doje je tumala mi ni sti go. Ta chaba doje je tungal ti so tang yom ra. Kola dewa dungal khaya le yom ra te kapse. Mane bi onde kaso mane ba khurang dungal yim ba she tok te bi. Dungal yim ba tok te ani kola mi ba me ni je ko karsana she tam je rang shen ji ma tu ba yim ba la ko mi she ba ra. Wa she ni你原本不列啥，原本不是那没写吧？没写吧了，等你原本不列啥，没写吧的，我软硬吧的，或者写样的，那人自己是那帮人。
So now, as for the suffering beyond any object, the noble beings experience this kind of compassion. The compassion is beyond any object, and they feel this compassion towards beings who are experiencing towards the beings in terms of their experience of the pervasive suffering of their conditioned. So here, the pervasive suffering of the conditioned is not a manifest sensation or feeling. It is a neutral sensation. There's no actual manifest sensation there with the pervasive suffering of the condition. But the noble beings, when they look at sentient beings and that that sentient beings are in this state of the pervasive suffering of the condition that has this neutral sensation where there's no sensation. That state is actually a state of unknowing. The sentient beings do not understand the nature of phenomena. They don't understand the reality of emptiness. So, in dependence on that unknowing, these beings will give rise to the afflictions and the karma, and they experience all kinds of suffering due to that. So these noble beings can see that in sentient beings. They see the state of unknowing, which is, as its kind of manifest character, is neutral, but nevertheless, it is still the nature of suffering. And so in this way, the noble beings can give rise to this kind of compassion, which is beyond any object, by taking into account the pervasive suffering of the conditioned and this unknowing.
Chaba doji dunga de shinto kokir yende tene topar kawayer. Topar kawayende tokengi tangsa de sursena pagwagi mato dokpiel mara.
So this suffering of the pervasive suffering of the conditioned is what is referred to as one more very hidden, more than just being hidden or not manifest. It's extremely hidden. It's extremely imperceptible. It's even more imperceptible than the previous type. And so this kind of phenomena, which is extremely imperceptible, extremely hidden, aside from noble beings, nobody else can perceive these kind of phenomena.
Pagwagi sisha dogi dunga de hekar tongu yore. Ajing anzogi Olamda jolam di tonga suji dunga de yorwa cha. Ani shine dunga limba hago gudwa. Enje mare pagwagi yorwa macha ngilaran dunga limba hago. Duje jingo bo kandeji yinayang te dunga limba. Semi yinayang dunga limba. Lü yinayang dunga limba. Wobo kanda kan yinba yang dunga limba te dar tutoktogu.
So when these noble beings perceive this kind of suffering, they perceive it directly and immediately. Unlike those on the path of accumulation and preparation, who can perceive the suffering of change because they understand that the experience of happiness will change into suffering. And so they thereby feel compassion for beings experiencing the suffering of change. Unlike them, where there's some kind of process, they have to understand in a way there's the cause and effect, and that the impermanent experience of pleasure will turn into pain. Unlike them, the noble beings, when they perceive the pervasive suffering of the condition, they perceive it immediately and directly. They understand directly how they understand directly that the mind itself is the suffering and all of the suffering that the mind will produce, and they understand that the body itself is suffering. Right in that moment, directly and immediately, they can see that.
Sanjeji duje jingo bo tenjala tekar dunga sikpa tang. Ini sosikiwo tenjala ki tekar dunga ma sikpa te ani kande sine pe shana kande sine yore sana chiba laktil dawa la duje la ni fu mi dos. Chiba tenzo tene lakbe dang la pu chung chung jishaba ina puti ani puti dungal yimba ko gi sorg mares puti dujero puti dujerde puti dungal yimba ko gi sorg mares sangge de ani miktan dawares sangge mitra de puchungcho de dingna na sawaina puchungcho de dungal de gidwa 재성 도제지 동할 때기 여바 상지지 공부였어. 우리도 관당 된다고 저 공부였어. 완전 나파강래 배 부적 나과강라 부샤만 간저 부디 동할이 마마자 하고 있는다. 완전 동할 때기면도 거기. 재성 완전 그 동할이 바 또그면도 상지기 말에 부디랑 동할을 들라. 부디 민나나 쇼에나 동할 가져요. 부코랑기 동할 때 두고도 부코랑기 동할 임바 때 두고도 부코랑기 동할 많이 받때 두고도 부디 민나나도 동할 때 부디 민나나 마도 라고 나나는데 동할 말에 다 상지기 가르치고 그래. 완전히 lakpa yeti puti dungal mare la gire mig nala zoti puti dungal re la gire zota mazul yewa shago de sanje ge yewa shago ma u khoran dungal re la gire mig nala zoba na sing sanje ge churwa di ne doje di dungal sigi yore sibor.
So how are we to understand the way in which noble beings can experience and see the subtle level of suffering, and that ordinary people cannot see this subtle level of suffering? Well, there's a verse that says that they
지금 치바 나는 뭐 부셔바나 치레스 부셔나 우디 동안에 뭐 또토 마레스 알바 미단 자와레스 미르티 우디 민가나 소아나 콜라도 마초 제상 우디 동안에 뭐 거기 시리레스.
So there's a verse that talks about the hair, small hair in the palm of the hand does not cause suffering to the ordinary person, but that the same hair is the suffering caused by the same hair when it's in the eye is how the noble beings are able to see this kind of suffering. So it's just like when we put a hair on the palm of our hand, it doesn't really cause us any discomfort. It's just a hair sitting there. But as soon as that same hair is in our eye, there's a lot of suffering and a discomfort or pain from that. So in the same way, these noble beings, they understand this subtle level of suffering to be just as painful as the hair that's gone into your eye, whereas we can't really experience that. We can't really feel it. So we are like as if we had the hair in the palm of our hand. So whether the hair is in the palm of your hand or whether the hair is in your eye, is the same hair. That hair is the cause of suffering when it's in your eye, and it does not experience the suffering when it's in the palm of your hand, but it's the same thing. That actually is the cause of suffering, that hair. So these noble beings, they can understand that, and they see that even though we're experiencing this, this subtle level of suffering, we're not experiencing it. It still is suffering, because they can see the nature of this cause of suffering, and they know that the hair, so to speak, is really the cause of suffering. Even though for us it's as if in the palm of our hand, for them they can see it clearly as if it is suffering of the hair and that's gone to our eye.
Dendi puti kadevese na yudan sendan 이거는 저기 오버 창마당 내년 창마를 된저 상마 켜봐도지 동아라 아 켜봐도지 동아기 산지 태가 동아 통요 허바되죠.
So in this analogy, the hair is the body, the mind, our possessions and enjoyments, and our karma and afflictions. And these noble beings, they can they understand that all of those things are in fact the pervasive suffering of the conditioned. They can see that those things are suffering.
대인들이 다 저기 이니 저기도 무슨 보트라야고 장네 테니 냠는 잡아이나 테니 상기 좀 된대기 대시 치고 거래나라 동을 셔버차 셔버 숨어요. 어떻게 냠는 잡도
Yeah, so we should all study this topic and train in this contemplation of the three root sufferings. And if we really do this well, take this into our practice well, then this will become a practice related to the teaching of the Buddha on the four truths of the noble ones, where he taught that you should understand suffering and so on and so forth. He said suffering must be understood and so forth, right? So by practicing this, taking this into our practice, we will be practicing that teaching taught by the Buddha.
미 너희도 말씀도 주셨어요. 미라 근데 동아 전부 개요래 스물 전부 개대 가르에서나 개람나지 시 대강라 따당와 치지 토백도나 인천바 탈지 토백도나 밑에 토도밖에 도나 대바 토도만큼 도만 신내네 아니 개담터요래스 다 동아 전부 전부 개래스 동아 총안에 신도만 보여래스
So now I have finished explaining the three root sufferings. And now the other category of sufferings in the human realm is that of the 8 great sufferings. So these are the 4 that consist of sufferings of birth, old age, sickness, and death, and an additional 4 of meeting with enemies that are opposed to us, parting with friends and other ones that are close to us, meeting with what we don't want, having to go through what we don't want, and finally losing what we want, not being able to get what we want. So there are these 8 great sufferings, and then as for minor sufferings, other minor sufferings, these are really uncountable, so many other minor sufferings.
다 뭐 예담나치 동아 침도 시에베 나네 단도 끼에도모데 시바이나 진행하는 소다 이번 번ning 되냐면 진행만 깨봐 임바래 완에 깨와 인디 되니 파마게 고다다 the trust 지산여 렘베 남시 년도 송 점대 되네 파맹마도 주고 왜
So among the 8 great sufferings, the first one is the suffering of birth. And for us being humans in this world, we take birth out of a womb. And what happens is the reproductive substances of the mother and father join together with the consciousness of the bardo being, and those 3 connect with one another and start the process of birth.
dortena tene walam zum william bachepala tene maita pai kwa tene parde namchi lungwa sigara parde namchi te parde tu long shi judo or tesing yamdo zong tesing mai ngala zong yana ngam to bi de chawi yes
So in summary, the semen of the father and the female red female reproductive element of the mother, those two meet together with the consciousness of the Bardo being, which is described as moving here and there like a wind. It's propelled along like a wind. When those three things meet within the womb of the mother, then this is how the formation of our human body happens.
네, 많이 내가 불안해. 값수 근데 많이 내가 와신 와라 텐데 es 많이 내가 마보테 근데 강보 메르메 근데 니파 나르나르 숨바 따르따르 시바 총교와 마바 코모교와스 es
So when the human body begins to develop within the mother's womb, there are said to be 5 stages to the development of the fetus within the womb. There is the metamerpo, the naranarpo, the tartarpo, and tartarpo,
강교와 강교 타보
I'll say all that. So the mermerpo, the nanarpo, the tadarpo, and then the solidified state, and then and then finally the round state.
저 반복 메르메포 세나 테니 파맹말라 쇼미 테니 덕 담보 렘바티 치베 이기 속 치바 보우속 투고 그 속디 간데 여레스나 메르메포 남시여레스 메르메포스나 차부 마인 라보 쇼나싱
추천해주래.
쇼낭싱 저
Shonen.
투바나싱
So the first of these is called the mermerpo in Tibetan. So what this refers to is when the fetus first starts to develop, the very beginning stage. And here, the body of that fetus is not really solid in any way. It has no real shape. It's more like a kind of jelly, like a yogurt or a kind of thick soup.
이바 나나보시바테 마잉와라 참에 된장이바 렘바기 치베 이디 민가 나나보시바 나나보시나 니 코디 니 와르레 도섬 파 칠라 덤밤 칠라 무리용와라 나나보로 칠라 나로 치르치메
So in that way, the shape of the fetus in the first week of pregnancy is called a mermerpo, this kind of like a jelly thing. And then the second one, which is called a nanarpo, this is refers to, nanarpo is the name for the shape of the fetus, the form of the fetus in the second week of pregnancy. And this term means that now the fetus has started to grow a little bit, and it's kind of taken on some shape. So I don't know, maybe you could translate that. Naranapo is kind of like, I don't know. It's, we can explain that word nar as a Nanarpo is kind of extended or slightly grown.
숨바 답답보세나 된dak 숨바 원라 참에 테네 된dak 숨바 르베기 치베 이민라 따르따르보 신 따르따르보 시르와 세와 데카나세나 테니 Subuki tini yala benzo tenyo ni. Subuki yala kuwa tang kangba la sowa kani tenyo wa. Gyugyu chakpa na tini tar ko na.
Gyugyu shosa.
Gyugyu tenyo na ngu doktor. Gyugyu tenyo wa. Gyugyu nanda.
So then the third stage is called the tartar bowl.
Nidi supta tenyo wa. Tango supta yo marwa. Shebi yo marwa. Ko sheb chagwa. Le tango. Nila tabtar.
So the third stage is the stage of the tartar bowl fetus. And this is the stage during the third week of pregnancy. And here, the fetus begins to form the limbs. These limbs start to kind of grow out of the fetus. So we have arms and legs, and the head starts to grow out of the fetus. So this is where there's some kind of a shape. Some kind of a shape of the fetus starts to form.
Hamituwa sanatini antunda. Mai ngala shone tene da shiba chakpe ke chibiki ip ne tangirwas. Tangirwas na tene shiba ke supo te pit chawro cha. Ne kirwati ne tangirwas.
Kirwati tse gukui dai.
Ta ko kirwati bura. Ko manda chaira.
Ari tartar tsik rangangi dara ben. Using
that's tamburi ra den gyugyu tengra ne ko tengre kangbo tengre gyugyu na tekar.
Tarzi the nagi tartar. So then the fourth stage is called Tangbo.
Tangwa.
Tangirwani.
Tansma chapo. Chapo chanake. That's what Tambo tabu mewa. Labo yoa. Merba yoa. Merba be taro chana changiwa. Tabu na pakiwa. So with the tabu chagora. Tambo labora. Tambo amagi kwa pog. Ame tap poi kwa the labora. Shoda was mother yamara. The Kaligani Kotaru Chak Gilgora. Cher chagora.
Changirai. So I think we can translate the mermerpo as a kind of jelly or like a fluid stage of jelly or fluid, and then nanarpo, the second one, as the stage of growth or extension, and then the third one, and the third one, tatarpo, we can translate as the stage of protrusions, you can say, like the arm and legs start to stick out, to protrude, so the state of protrusions.
And
then this fourth stage, is during the fourth week of pregnancy, and this fourth stage is called the solidified stage. And here the fetus begins to become more solidified, and the body starts to take on more of a solid shape. And the beginning, in the first stage of the jelly-like stage, at the beginning with the reproductive fluids, there's nothing really there but fluid. It's just this kind of fluid and jelly, but then it becomes bigger, and then the limbs start to grow out, and now here it becomes more solid. And now the fifth stage is the stage of the round fetus. So here, all the body parts of the fetus have formed distinctly. And now there was this kind of, the fetus is in a kind of curled up like a ball shape. So this is referred to as the stage of the ball-like fetus, or the
어디
round fetus.
어디 타면만 나나 보고 차우출이 거를 아니 시다다 신경 말에 빼져나가 된거 말을 하여튼 저 볼라 아이디든 저 배하고 시기로.
As for myself, I don't know too much about this process of the development of the fetus. But doctors, they tend to know about this in great detail, but I don't know much. I know what is written in our texts.
대가 부주와 카리요레스 대가블라 동안 카리요레스 나트니 유르이 동안에 유르니 베 동안 침보이 알았나 담보 메르메 보여라 메르메르 포티 나르나르 포티 나르나르 포티 따르따르 포티 따르따르 포티 청규라 큐 청규티 코로나 비례한데 유르니 베 강을이야 유르이 동안이에스.
But in any case, the suffering that is experienced here is the suffering that comes along with changing. These fetuses, they really experience great suffering because of all the changes they go through. They start off as a kind of jelly-like substance, more fluid, like a yogurt consistency, or like a thick soup kind of consistency. And then they change into this by enlarging, and then their limbs start to stick out, and then they become this round ball-like shape. So there's a lot of suffering that comes along with going through all of those changes.
뭐 되는 많이 내고나 나비래 다 다른 게 뒤지지 그러다 저도도.
Yeah. Now so these are referred to as the 5 stages experienced within the womb, and this all the time we have today for. So let's together recite the dedication and aspiration.
Sonam de damrese gwane topne nebe damnam alrede indan atsebalam Drupla Sibes tolendo jolomar show. Come on, like I should do it. Yes, I mean, Tsering on it, that's it. The person on it, that's it. And it did out the computer and you mentioned it again, that's it. Yes, it's not young.
So I want to wish everyone, bring everyone my good wishes. I want to I wish that you all have a long life, and I wish that you all have great happiness within your life. And additionally, I wish that you all practice the dharma in a timely fashion, the right time, and yes, all these wishes. So this word in Tibetan, tashi, tashi-bait refers to having all the good things being in place, all good things for us. And the opposite, ta-mishipa, refers to not having good things, having like wrong or bad things in place. So I wish all of you these good things, tashi.
Thank you. Bye-bye.